Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Laughing Plague of Tanganyika. Close your eyes and imagine the northwestern edge of what is now Tanzania, where the vast, slate-blue waters of Lake Victoria meet the rugged greenery of the Bukoba district. The year is 1962. It is a time of transition, a season of heavy humidity and shifting political tides. Here, in the quiet village of Kashasha, the air carries the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. The dampness of the earth seems to hold the secrets of the land. Life moves with a deliberate, rhythmic, slow pace. The mornings are often shrouded in a fine mist that clings to the banana groves and the red clay paths. It is a place where silence is respected, and the sounds of the wilderness, the distant call of a bird, the rustle of leaves, are the only interruptions to the stillness. At the heart of this landscape sits the Kashasha Girls' Middle School. A mission-run institution, its buildings are modest but sturdy, with walls that have seen years of discipline and prayer. The windows are open to catch whatever breeze might wander up from the lake, and the sound of chalk on slate is a constant companion to the students. There are 159 girls here, aged 12 to 18. They move through the corridors and halls with the practiced grace of youth under careful supervision. The school is a world unto itself, a pocket of learning amidst the beauty of the Great Lakes region. But on this particular day, the 31st of January, 1962, the structure begins to tremble from within, not from a physical force, but from a sound that defies the mission's order. The morning of January 31st began exactly like any other. The sun rose behind a veil of clouds, casting a soft, pearlescent glow over the classrooms. The girls sat at their wooden desks, their minds focused on the lessons. There was a certain weight to the air, a tension that seemed to hum just below the surface. Tanganyika had celebrated its independence from Britain only weeks before, in December of 1961. The world was changing, and with that change came a new, unspoken pressure. The weight of expectations and the rigid discipline of a boarding school life that offered little room for release. In the quiet of the morning, that pressure found its first outlet. The teachers guided them through grammar, unaware that the syllabus was about to be discarded for something far more complex and terrifying. It started in a single classroom among 3 girls. There was no joke told, no amusing mishap to trigger the reaction. It began as a small, isolated sound, a giggle that escaped, unbidden, from the lips of one student. At first, it seemed like a simple lapse in concentration. But the giggle did not fade. Instead, it grew, bubbling up from deep within her chest until it became a full, rhythmic laugh. Within moments, the girl beside her caught the same rhythm. Then, a third joined in. It was a strange, jagged sound, devoid of the warmth usually associated with mirth. This was not the laughter of a shared secret or a funny story. It was sharp, persistent, and entirely uncontrollable. The girls clutched their wooden desks, their eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and something that looked very much like fear. The teacher stopped speaking, the chalk suspended in midair. The rest of the class turned to look, their faces a mask of curiosity that slowly curdled into unease. The laughter of the 3 girls intensified. They were now heaving, their bodies racking with the physical effort of the sound. Tears began to stream down their faces, but they weren't tears of joy. These were the tears of exhaustion. Their breathing became shallow and erratic, a desperate gasping for air between the bursts of sound. One of the girls tried to cover her mouth, her hands shaking, but the laughter forced its way through her fingers, a high-pitched, manic trill that echoed off the high ceilings. It was as if a physical force had taken hold of them, a phantom guest that refused to leave until it had spent every ounce of their energy. The contagion was subtle at first, a ripple in a pond. The teacher, unable to restore order, felt a cold prickle of alarm. This was not the typical mischief of teenagers. This was something visceral. The sound of the laughter began to leak out of the classroom, drifting into the corridors and reaching the ears of students in adjacent rooms. In the silence of the mission school, the sound was abrasive and alien. The three girls were now in the grip of a full-blown episode, their laughter occasionally giving way to brief, sharp sobs or aimless, restless movements. They could not stop. They could not explain why they were laughing. The laughter hung in the air like a heavy curtain. As the minutes turned into hours, the first spark at Kashasha had been lit. The school was about to become the epicenter of a mystery that would defy every explanation. The air in Kashasha during January of 1962 was thick and expectant, a humid veil that pressed against the windows of the mission boarding school. What began as a fleeting moment of levity between three girls had, within days, transformed into a physical presence, moving through the hallways like a draft in a locked room. Imagine the corridors, the scent of old wood and the sound of footsteps. But over those familiar sounds, there was now a new, persistent rhythm. It was a repetitive, staccato sound that lacked the warmth of a joke. It was the sound of a nervous system under siege, a rhythmic pulsing of breath that forced its way out of young lungs without any permission from the mind or the heart. It was the beginning of the end for order. Inside the dormitory walls, the numbers told a story of a silent, invisible invasion. Out of the 159 students, a staggering 95 were soon swept into the current. These girls, ranging from 12 to 18 years of age, were caught in a loop that defied the logic of their teachers. Imagine the sleeping quarters. One girl would begin with a small, involuntary huff of air, and soon the girl in the next cot would find her own chest tightening. It was a chain reaction that ignored the boundaries of friendship. 159 young women had entered the term with dreams of education, but for 95 of them, the present had become a relentless cycle of sound and motion that they simply could not switch off, no matter how they tried. To call it laughter is a betrayal of the word's meaning. In our dreams, laughter is a release, a spark of joy. But for the 95, it was a mechanical reflex. It was often interspersed with sudden bursts of weeping, as if the body were trying every emotional outlet to vent a pressure it could not name. The girls' eyes were often wide, filled not with mirth but with a confused sort of terror, their pupils dilated as they looked at one another through a haze of exertion. They were deeply, bone-wearily tired. Some would laugh for hours, their abdominal muscles aching and their throats raw from the constant passage of air. When the laughter subsided, it was replaced by a heavy, restless silence or a fit of sobbing that felt just as forced. As the days stretched through February and into March, the physical toll became impossible to ignore. This was no longer a disruption, it was a crisis of the body. The girls suffered from respiratory distress, their breathing becoming shallow as the fits persisted. Some would faint from the lack of oxygen, their bodies finally slumping into a merciful, temporary unconsciousness. Others reported sharp pains or developed mysterious rashes that bloomed across their skin like heat maps of internal distress. There was a sense of frantic restlessness, a need to move, to pace, to do anything other than sit still in the suffocating quiet of a lesson they could no longer follow. The school had become a theater of the involuntary, where the mind had lost its grip on the steering wheel of the form. An unsettling aspect was the invisible wall between the generations. The teaching staff, the adults who ran the mission with a firm hand, remained entirely untouched. They walked the same halls and ate the same food, yet they were immune to the sound of 95. They watched with a mixture of bewilderment and growing alarm as their authority evaporated. No amount of discipline or gentle comfort could break the spell. It was as if the students were tuned to a frequency that the adults could no longer hear, a vibration of collective anxiety. The independence of Tanganyika, gained only weeks before in December of 1961, had brought new expectations. For these girls, caught between village traditions and the strict mission structure, The pressure had found a strange, vocal outlet that nobody could quiet, no matter how many prayers were whispered. By the middle of March, the situation reached a breaking point. On the 18th of March, 1962, the decision was finally made to close the school. The authorities hoped that by sending the girls back to their families, the laughter would finally burn itself out. They imagined the familiar surroundings of home would provide the reset these weary minds required. But as the 95 packed their belongings, they carried more than just books. They carried the rhythm of the school within them, a silent passenger waiting to find its voice once more in the villages beyond the gates. The silence that followed the departure was not a peace, but a pause in a symphony that was only just beginning its reach. They left behind empty desks and a mystery that would travel many miles. The sound of 95 was about to become the sound of many more. The morning of March 18th, 1962, did not arrive with a sense of relief, but rather with the heavy, stagnant weight of surrender. For weeks, the mission school in Kashasha had been a crucible of sound, a cacophony of rhythmic, hollow laughter that seemed to bounce off the corrugated iron roofs and soak into the very bricks of the dormitories. The officials, their faces lined with the exhaustion of 48 days of failed containment, stood by the heavy gates. There was a profound silence in their movements as they prepared to do the only thing left to them. They believed that by dispersing the students, they would thin the herd of the afflicted, effectively starving the phenomenon of its fuel. They imagined the laughter would simply dissipate into the open air of the surrounding hills, vanishing like smoke once the girls were no longer huddled together in their crowded classrooms. Imagine the sound of 95 girls, their belongings tied in small bundles, shuffling toward the exit. Out of the 159 students who called this mission home, more than half were now carrying something invisible within them. As the heavy iron padlock clicked shut for the final time that season, the sound echoed across the courtyard. A sharp, metallic punctuation to an experiment in education that had gone horribly wrong. The teaching staff, 2 Europeans and 3 Africans, watched from the shadows of the veranda. They were untouched by the physical symptoms, yet their spirits were frayed. They saw their students not as scholars, but as vessels of an inexplicable energy. The red dust of the road began to rise, coating the girls' shoes as they stepped out beyond the stone walls, heading into a world that was entirely unprepared for their arrival. The walk home for many was not a journey of joy. The laughter, you must understand, was never a sign of mirth. It was a physical seizure, a violent shaking of the diaphragm often accompanied by streaming tears, respiratory distress, and even fainting. Some girls would walk for a mile in perfect, eerie silence, only to be struck by a fit so intense they would collapse into the dry grass, their bodies thrashing against the earth. They were moving toward villages scattered across the Bukoba district, some traveling as far as 55 miles to the west. As they walked, the heat of the afternoon sun beat down, and the humidity from Lake Victoria clung to their skin like a damp shroud. They carried the infection in their breath and in their presence, moving like a slow-moving weather front toward the unsuspecting village of Nshamba. When the first groups reached Nshamba, a village complex of roughly 10,000 souls, the reunion with their families was marked by a chilling transformation. A mother would reach out to embrace her daughter, grateful for her return, only to watch the girl's face contort. The eyes would widen, the chest would heave, and then the sound would begin, that high, repetitive, rhythmic barking that defied all logic. Within 10 days of the school's closure, the walls of the mission were no longer the boundary of the crisis. In the small, thatched-roof homes and the open-air markets of Nshamba, the atmosphere began to shift. The parents, who had initially viewed the school's reports with skepticism or distant concern, were suddenly confronted with the reality of the shaking, weeping, and laughing children in their own backyards. By the time April arrived, the decision to close the gates was seen for what it truly was, a tragic catalyst. In Nshamba alone, 217 people were soon gripped by the same symptoms. The phenomenon had jumped the gap from the adolescents to the adults, affecting young men and women who had never stepped foot inside the Kashasha mission. The village, once a place of predictable routines and the quiet hum of agricultural life, became a landscape of unpredictable outbursts. A man tilling his field might suddenly drop his tools, overcome by a fit of screaming laughter that could last for hours or even days. Some reports from that time speak of victims suffering for as long as 16 days, their bodies reaching the absolute limits of physical endurance, their minds trapped in a loop of emotional expression they could not control. The officials had tried to lock the door on a ghost, only to realize the ghost was already in the wind. The closure of the institution had effectively decentralized the epidemic, turning a localized problem into a regional emergency. Panic began to take root in the surrounding communities. Rumors of poisoned food or cursed air began to circulate, fueling the very stress and anxiety that many modern researchers believe was the root of the illness. As the sun set over the hills of Tanganyika in late March, the laughter did not fade with the light. Instead, it echoed from village to village, a haunting reminder that some things, once unleashed, cannot be contained by iron bars or stone walls. The gates were closed, the classrooms were empty, but the shadows were now filled with the sound of 1,000 people laughing in the dark. The officials at the Kashasha school had tried to lock the door on a ghost, only to realize the ghost was already in the wind. When they shuttered the windows and sent the students away on March 18, 1962, they believed they were providing a cure through distance. They imagined that by dissolving the group, they would dissolve the illness. But as the girls began their long journey home, they carried the tremors within them. Some traveled by foot, their sandals clicking against the dry earth of the Muleba district, while others found passage on slow-moving vehicles that bumped along the dusty arteries connecting the mission to the wider world. One such path led 55 miles west of Bukoba, winding through the lush, rolling hills toward the village complex of Nshamba. For these girls, the journey was not a return to sanctuary, but a migration of the very chaos they were meant to leave behind. The air in those transit moments was heavy and still, the kind of silence that precedes a summer storm, as the internal pressure of their condition waited for a new space to occupy. Nshamba was a place of deep rhythms and quiet industry, a community of nearly 10,000 people where the life of the village was governed by the sun and the seasons. When the students first arrived back at their family huts, there was a brief, deceptive window of peace. For 10 days, the village remained as it always had been. The parents welcomed their daughters home, perhaps concerned by the stories of the school's closure, but relieved to see them resting in the shade of the banana groves. They watched the girls closely, looking for the signs the missionaries had whispered about. But for those first 240 hours, the laughter seemed to have vanished into the thin mountain air. It was a period of eerie incubation. The villagers went about their daily chores, tending to their small plots of land and gathering at the markets, unaware that the social fabric of Nshamba was about to be pulled apart by an invisible thread. The girls were quiet, but their bodies were still vibrating with the residue of the mission house episodes, a low-frequency anxiety that was searching for a new spark. The spark finally caught on March 28th. It began not in the schoolroom, but in the heart of the home. One of the returning girls, seated among her kin, felt the familiar rising tide of heat in her chest. The laughter that followed was not the sound of a child's joy. It was a jagged, mechanical sequence of sounds that cut through the afternoon calm. Within hours, the walls of the village began to echo. This was no longer a contained incident among students. It was a community-wide crisis. As the sun set over the western horizon, the sound of rhythmic, uncontrollable giggling began to drift from hut to hut, carried by the evening breeze. The phenomenon had successfully transitioned from the institutional setting of the mission to the raw, domestic life of the village. In those first few nights, the darkness of Nshamba was punctuated by the strange, hollow barking of people who could not stop themselves, a sound that transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and threatening. As April arrived and turned into May, the scale of the outbreak became terrifying. The numbers climbed steadily until 217 people were caught in the grip of the plague. But the most chilling development in Nshamba was the demographic shift. At the Kashasha school, the illness had been a mystery of girlhood, something that could be dismissed as the fragility of youth. In Nshamba, that boundary crumbled. The laughter began to seize young adults of both sexes. Strong men who worked the fields found themselves collapsing into fits of weeping and laughing, their muscles twitching with a restlessness they could not master. Mothers, while trying to soothe their daughters, would suddenly find their own pupils dilating, their own breath coming in short, panicked gasps until they too succumbed to the rhythm. The sight of grown men and women, pillars of the community, losing their autonomy to a phantom giggle sent a wave of genuine terror through the district. It was no longer just a schoolgirl's malady. It was a spreading madness that seemed to respect no age and no station. To look into the eyes of the afflicted in Nshamba was to see a person trapped behind a glass wall. Medical observers who reached the village noted the physiological markers, the exaggerated reflexes, the way a simple touch could trigger a violent, thrashing response. The laughter was often interspersed with long periods of agonizing crying, a mournful sound that suggested the victims were fully aware of their loss of control. Some reported a sensation of being chased by invisible figures, a collective hallucination of pursuit that forced them to run aimlessly through the village until they collapsed from sheer exhaustion. They described a feeling of things moving about inside their heads, a physical sensation of the mind being occupied by an intruder. Because there was no fever, no rash, and no organic trace of poison in the food or water, the villagers began to look toward the supernatural. Some whispered that the very atmosphere had been poisoned by recent atomic tests in distant lands, while others believed it was a curse that moved through the air like a shadow. The crisis in Nshamba lasted for 34 days, a grueling month where the normal operations of life simply ceased. The markets grew quiet, save for the occasional burst of hysterical sound. The fields were left untended as families stayed huddled in their homes, terrified that a single glance at a laughing neighbor would seal their own fate. This was the moment the Laughing Plague became a legend, the moment it proved it could jump from the schoolhouse to the town square, from the child to the parent. By the time the fits began to subside in late May, the village was exhausted, its residents haunted by the memory of their own bodies betraying them. 217 souls had been marked by the event, and the surrounding regions watched in paralyzed fear, knowing that the girls from Kashasha had many more homes to return to, and many more villages were still waiting in the silence. The air near the port town of Bukoba carries a different weight than the dry, inland hills of Nshamba. Here, the presence of the Great Lake, Victoria, is felt in every breath, a damp, heavy humidity that clings to the skin and softens the edges of the horizon. As May of 1962 progressed, this moisture seemed to trap the growing sense of unease that was drifting across the district. We have seen how the laughter consumed the village of Nshamba for 34 days, turning a place of commerce into a landscape of exhaustion. But the shadow was not content to stay within those borders. It was moving, invisible and silent, traveling along the red dirt paths and the cooling evening breezes, seeking the next place where the pressure of a changing world had become too much to bear. The transition from the inland crisis to the lakeside was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, creeping realization that the walls built to protect the young were beginning to crumble. On the outskirts of Bukoba sat the Ramasheni Girls' Middle School. It was an institution defined by its order, a place where 154 young women were being prepared for a future in a newly independent nation. The classrooms were filled with the sounds of scratching graphite and the soft murmur of lessons, the very picture of academic discipline. But beneath this surface of colonial structure and post-independence hope, a different energy was humming. By the middle of May, the students had heard the rumors. They knew of the girls in Kashasha who had been sent home months earlier. They knew that some of those girls now lived in the very neighborhoods surrounding Ramashani. The boundary between the school and the world outside was more porous than the teachers cared to admit. The infection was no longer a distant story. It was a neighbor, a cousin, a ghost waiting at the school gate. Imagine the scene in those final weeks of May. The sun hangs low over the lake, casting long, golden shadows across the school courtyard. The girls move in pairs, whispering about the laughing disease that had paralyzed the schools to the west. There is a specific kind of tension that exists in a boarding school, a shared pulse, an environment where emotions are amplified by proximity and the strictness of the routine. The teachers, perhaps sensing the fragility of the atmosphere, redoubled their efforts to maintain decorum. But you cannot command the subconscious to remain quiet. The students from Kashasha who had returned to this area brought with them more than just their belongings. They brought the memory of the release, the memory of the laughter that broke the rules. It was a psychological spark landing in a room filled with dry silk. All it needed was a single moment of weakness to ignite the entire house. The ignition finally came as the calendar turned toward the 10th of June, but the symptoms had been simmering throughout the latter half of May. When the first girl at Ramashani finally broke, it wasn't a joke that triggered it. It was the sheer, crushing weight of a normal afternoon. The sound of her laughter was not the sound of joy. It was a jagged, rhythmic barking that echoed through the stone corridors, sharp enough to make the other students jump. Within hours, the count had risen. By the end of the first week, 48 of the 154 girls were caught in the cycle. The faculty watched in horror as their orderly school transformed into a theater of the surreal. 48 voices, once used for prayers and recitations, were now locked in a discordant symphony of gasping giggles and heart-wrenching sobs. The phenomenon had officially claimed its second major victim in the educational system. Medical observers who arrived at Ramashani noted details that were as clinical as they were terrifying. They looked into the eyes of the girls and found pupils that were strangely dilated, staring into a distance that no one else could see. When they tested the girls' reflexes, the responses were exaggerated, as if their nervous systems were tuned to a frequency that was far too high. There was no fever, no rash, no physical evidence of a virus or a toxin. Yet the girls were suffering. They were restless, their bodies twitching with a frantic energy that made them run aimlessly across the grounds until they collapsed from sheer fatigue. If a teacher or a nurse tried to restrain them, the girls would sometimes lash out with a sudden, uncharacteristic violence, driven by a fear they could not articulate. This was the physical manifestation of a collective spirit reaching its breaking point, a cry for help disguised as a fit of mirth. By the 18th of June, the battle for order at Ramashani was lost. The school authorities, exhausted and bewildered, followed the precedent set by Kashasha and Nshamba. They closed the doors. The girls were sent back to their villages, dispersing the 48 cases into the wider community like seeds scattered by a storm. The closure was meant to stop the spread, but it only served to confirm the terrifying reality of the situation. This was no longer a localized event or a strange fluke of a single village. The fall of the second school proved that the Laughing Plague was a chain reaction, a wave of social contagion that was gaining momentum. As the students left, the empty classrooms of Bukoba stood as silent monuments to an invisible force. The laughter was moving on, weaving its way through the landscape, and the people of Tanganyika could only wonder whose voice would be the next to break the silence. The gates of the schools may have been locked, but for those inside the cycle, The struggle was only just beginning to manifest in ways that moved far beyond a simple sound. To the outside world, it was being called a laughter epidemic, a name that suggests something light, perhaps even whimsical. But for the girls of Kashasha and Ramasheni, there was no whimsy to be found in the physical wreckage of their own bodies. Imagine, if you will, the weight of a long day, where your muscles feel leaden and your mind yearns for the softness of a pillow. Now, imagine that instead of rest, your body is suddenly gripped by a force that demands every ounce of your oxygen, forcing your lungs to expand and contract with a violent, rhythmic intensity that you cannot command to stop. This was the physical toll of the 1962 outbreak, a landscape of exhaustion where the human frame was pushed to its absolute limit by a mind that had seemingly lost its internal anchor. Medical reports from that time, carefully documented by doctors like Rankin and Phillip, describe a scene that was far from joyful. They spoke of respiratory distress that left pupils gasping, their chests heaving as if they had just run a marathon while standing perfectly still. The laughter was not a choice. It was a motor-driven reflex that bypassed the will. As the minutes stretched into hours, and for some, those hours stretched into days, the toll on the respiratory system became staggering. The girls would experience hyperpnea, a state where the depth of their breathing increased so significantly that their blood chemistry began to shift. This led to a strange, tingling numbness in the hands and feet, a sensation of being disconnected from one's own skin. They were caught in a loop of air and sound, a mechanical repetition that burned through their caloric reserves until they were left trembling, their ribs aching from the constant, involuntary shearing of the diaphragm. Beyond the breath, there was the pain. It is a detail often omitted from the popular retellings of the story, but the victims frequently reported sharp, stabbing sensations in their abdomens and chests. Their muscles, overworked by the constant spasms of the episodes, grew knotted and sore. Some girls developed mysterious skin rashes, angry red patches that bloomed across their arms and necks, a physical manifestation of the internal fire that seemed to be burning through them. When the doctors examined them, they found neurological signs that were impossible to ignore. The pupils of the girls' eyes were often dilated, fixed and wide, as if they were staring into a great darkness, even in the bright light of the African sun. Their reflexes were exaggerated, their limbs jumping at the slightest touch. Their nervous systems hummed at a frequency that the human body was never designed to sustain for long. It was as if every wire in their bodies was being overcharged by a current they could not shut off. Then came the fainting. After a bout that might last anywhere from a few minutes to several hours, the body would simply give up. The term for it is syncope, a sudden loss of consciousness caused by a drop in blood pressure or a lack of oxygen to the brain. In the dormitories of the mission schools, girls would be laughing one moment, their voices high and strained, and in the next, they would collapse like puppets with their strings cut. These were not gentle faints. They were heavy, sudden drops onto the hard floors. The silence that followed a collapse was often more terrifying than the noise that preceded it. It was a silence filled with the sound of shallow, ragged breathing as the victim lay motionless, their face pale, their body finally allowed a brief, forced respite from the madness. But even this rest was fragile. For many, the cycle would repeat itself, sometimes up to 4 times in a single week, leaving them in a state of perpetual dread, never knowing when their own muscles would betray them again. Perhaps most haunting was the transition from laughter to tears. The clinical notes emphasize that this was an epidemic of both laughing and crying. A girl might be doubled over in what looked like mirth, only for her expression to shatter into one of profound, inconsolable grief without a second of transition. The sobbing was as uncontrollable as the laughter had been, deep and racking, shaking their small frames until they were physically spent. This volatility suggested a complete breakdown of the emotional regulation centers in the brain. They were experiencing a form of motor hysteria where the body's release valve had been jammed open. They were not sad, and they were not happy. They were simply overwhelmed. The doctors found no fever, no virus, and no poison in the food. Lumbar punctures and blood tests all came back normal, which in many ways made the physical suffering even more difficult to bear. There was no pill to take, no ointment to apply. There was only the waiting, the breathing, and the slow, agonizing crawl toward a recovery that felt miles away. By the time the schools had been closed for several weeks, the 1,000-plus individuals affected across the region were walking ghosts of their former selves. The average duration of the illness was about 7 days, though some suffered for as long as 16. During those 16 days, the toll on the spirit was matched only by the toll on the flesh. They were malnourished, having been unable to keep down food during the height of their attacks, and their voices had grown hoarse and raspy. When you look at the photographs of the era, you see the exhaustion in their eyes, a deep, sunken weariness that speaks of a battle fought within the very marrow of their bones. The laughter had taken everything from them. It had stolen their breath, their strength, and their dignity, leaving behind a community of young people who were united by a fatigue so deep it seemed to settle into the very earth they walked upon. As we move forward into the shadows of this story, remember the silence of those recovery rooms, where the only sound was the slow, steady heartbeat of a generation trying to find its way back to calm. The dust of the road settled slowly as 2 men of science arrived in the Kajara region, their Land Rover carrying the weight of medical bags and a heavy sense of bewilderment. Dr. A.M. Rankin, arriving from the Makerere University College in Uganda, and Dr. P.J. Phillip, the local medical officer for Bukoba, did not encounter a scene of joy. Instead, they found a landscape gripped by an invisible, laughing predator. The year was 1962, and the air was thick with the scent of ripening bananas and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. As they stepped out into the humid heat, the sound hit them. Not a chorus of merriment, but a jagged, rhythmic gasping that echoed from the open windows of the dormitories. It was a sound that defied the order of their clinical training, a sound that seemed to vibrate against the very leaves of the trees. They were here to find a physical cause, a microscopic invader, or a chemical poison that could explain why over 1,000 people were losing their minds to mirth and misery. They began their work in the dim light of the clinics, surrounded by the scratching of pens on clipboards and the restless shuffling of patients who could not sit still. The clinical examinations began with a meticulous focus on the bodies of the afflicted. Dr. Rankin and Dr. Phillip moved from bed to bed, their hands steady as they checked for the telltale signs of known diseases. They looked for the heat of a fever, expecting to find the soaring temperatures associated with malaria or meningitis, but the thermometers returned readings that were stubbornly normal. They checked for the stiffness of the neck that would signal a swelling of the brain, yet the patients' necks remained supple, even as their torsos thrashed with uncontrollable energy. The doctors noted a peculiar dilation of the pupils, the dark centers of the eyes widening as if reacting to a light that no one else could see. When they tapped the knees of the young girls with their rubber mallets, the tendon reflexes were exaggerated, jumping with a startling electric intensity. There were no tremors of the hands, no loss of consciousness, and no signs of the physical wasting one might expect from a true plague. The victims were physically healthy, their hearts beating strong and their lungs clear, yet they were trapped in a cycle of laughing and crying that lasted anywhere from a few minutes to several hours at a time. If the cause was not living within the blood, perhaps it was being ingested from the earth. The investigators turned their attention to the food supply, suspecting a shadow of the Great Hunger or the ergot poisonings of old Europe. They examined the maize flour, sifting through the grains with magnifying glasses, searching for foreign seeds or the dark, parasitic fungi of ergotism that had caused similar dancing manias in centuries past. They took samples of the matoke bananas and the local beans, tracing the path of the food from the nearby villages to the school kitchens. They noted that the girls at the Kashasha school ate the same meat and vegetables as the villagers who remained unaffected, a detail that deepened the mystery. They looked at the water, comparing the sealed rainwater tanks of the mission school to the open wells and flowing streams of the smaller settlements. Everywhere they looked for a toxin, they found only the ordinary elements of Tanzanian life. There were no tainted harvests, no poisoned wells, and no evidence of a common chemical thread that could weave such a complex tapestry of distress across 55 miles of rugged terrain. The investigation then took a more invasive turn as the doctors sought to peer inside the very chemistry of the victims. 15 active cases were chosen, and with the gentle precision of the needle, blood was drawn from their veins. These vials, carrying the deep crimson essence of the Laughing Plague, were packed into cooling crates and flown across the border to the Virus Research Institute in Entebbe, Uganda. In the sterile silence of the laboratory, scientists attempted to culture a virus from the samples, watching for any sign of growth in the Petri dishes. They tested for viral antibodies, searching for the ghost of an infection that might have already passed through the system. Days turned into weeks as the medical community waited for the verdict from the microscopes. The results were chilling in their emptiness. There were no viruses to be found. No antibodies were detected in those who had recovered, nor in those still in the throes of the attacks. Virologically, the patients were as clear as the lake water on a calm day. The biological search was hitting a wall of silence, leaving the doctors to wonder if they were looking for a ghost with the tools of a mechanic. The frustration of the medical team grew as they systematically ruled out every organic possibility. They considered encephalitis, a swelling of the brain that can cause erratic behavior, but the lack of fatalities and the absence of neurological deficits after the attacks made it an unlikely candidate. They questioned the girls about their experiences, listening to stories of things moving around inside their heads and the terrifying sensation of being chased by an unseen pursuer. These were the hallmarks of a mind under siege, yet the physical vessel showed no cracks. The doctors watched as a girl would transition from a state of total normalcy into a violent, thrashing episode of laughter, only to collapse into tears of exhaustion moments later. When they tried to restrain the patients during these fits, the girls reacted with a surprising, almost supernatural strength, as if the laughter provided a fuel that the body was not meant to burn. By the time they reached the middle of 1962, the search for a source in the physical world was beginning to falter. The medical reports started to use a different kind of language, moving away from toxins and toward the shadows of the human psyche. In the end, Rankin and Philip were left with a stack of clean lab results and a region that was still very much in crisis. 14 schools had been forced to shut their doors, and the laughter was no longer a curious local anomaly. It was a public health emergency. The doctors realized that the contagion was not spreading through the air or the water, but through the eyes and the ears. It was a motor variant of what they called mass hysteria, a psychogenic illness that bypassed the immune system and struck directly at the spirit. They observed that the symptoms were transmitted by sight and sound, leaping from one girl to another like a spark in dry grass. The lack of organic findings was, in itself, the final piece of evidence. They concluded that this was a culturally determined disease, a reaction to a world that was changing too fast for the young to follow. As the sun set over the hills of Bukoba, the doctors packed their instruments, knowing that the cure would not be found in a bottle of medicine, but in the slow, difficult process of understanding a heart under pressure. The source had been found, but it was not a virus. It was the unbearable weight of being. Imagine the western shores of Lake Victoria, where the water meets the land in a soft, rhythmic pulse. In the early months of 1962, the air in the Bukoba region was heavy, not just with the impending rain of the season, but with a profound, invisible weight. To understand why 3 young girls in a classroom began to laugh until they wept, we must look beyond the physical symptoms and into the very soil of the country. Tanganyika was a landscape in transition, a place where the old ways of the ancestors and the new demands of a modern nation were colliding with a quiet, terrifying force. The doctors had found no poison in the food, but they had perhaps overlooked the most potent toxin of all: the relentless, grinding pressure of change. On the 9th of December, 1961, only 7 weeks before the first laugh echoed, Tanganyika had stepped out from under the long shadow of British colonial rule. Independence brought a surge of joy, a feeling of liberation that filled the streets. But as the flags were raised, a different kind of tension settled in the rural villages. The new government was eager to prove its worth on the world stage. There was an urgent need for a new generation of leaders and professionals. The children of Tanganyika, especially those in the prestigious mission schools, were no longer just students. They were symbols of a nation's future, and the expectations placed upon their young shoulders were immense and heavy for them to carry through those quiet halls. In these boarding schools, the discipline was absolute. At the girls' middle school in Kashasha, the environment was designed as a sanctuary of learning, but it felt like a fortress of isolation. The architecture itself spoke of control. Accounts describe windowless walls designed to keep the students' eyes fixed on their books, preventing them from catching glimpses of the life they had left behind. The girls were often far from home, separated from the soft voices of their mothers and the steady presence of their families. They lived in a world of rigid schedules, English lessons, and the constant demand for excellence. Every hour was accounted for, and every failure was seen as a betrayal of the family who had sacrificed so much to send them there. This was the era of the 1962 Education Ordinance, a time when the curriculum was being rewritten to forge a new national identity. The girls were caught on a bridge between 2 worlds that did not yet know how to speak to one another. At home, the traditional elders still held the wisdom of generations. Life there was governed by the cycles of the moon and the deep-rooted beliefs of their ancestors. But in the classroom, they were taught the logic of the West and the history of empires. This cultural dissonance created a fracture in the psyche. They were being pulled in 2 directions, told to honor their roots while being forced to outgrow them in pursuit of a modern dream they did not yet fully understand. Psychologists like Robert Bartholomew would later point to this environment as the perfect breeding ground for mass psychogenic illness. They suggested that when a group, particularly those with very little power, find themselves trapped in a situation of extreme stress with no way to protest, the body finds its own way to scream. For the schoolgirls of Kashasha, who were expected to be silent and perfect, the laughter was not an expression of joy. It was a conversion reaction, a physical manifestation of internal turmoil that the mind could no longer contain. It was a safety valve, a sudden and violent release of pent-up anxiety that had been building since the day the new flag first caught the wind across the lake. As we listen to the story of the Laughing Plague, we must hear the silence that preceded it. The silence of the long study hours and the silence of the girls who were not allowed to speak their fears. The laughter was a breaking of that silence. It was a language of the body that spoke of the exhaustion of being a pioneer in a new world. The girls were not just laughing. They were reacting to the shifting tectonic plates of their culture. The landscape of stress was vast, stretching from the coffee plantations of the north to the very heart of the government. And in the small village of Kashasha, it simply found its first, most tragic voice in the middle of a warm afternoon. By the time the epidemic reached its peak, affecting over 1,000 people across 14 different schools, the sociological landscape had become as fractured as the minds of the sufferers. The closure of the schools only served to carry the tension back into the heart of the communities. Each girl who returned home brought with her the invisible seeds of this collective trauma. The laughter followed them into the markets and into the homes where traditional ways were still practiced. It was a viral manifestation of a nation's growing pains, a mirror held up to a world in flux, reflecting the terrifying reality of what happens when the human heart is asked to carry more weight than it was ever meant to bear alone. By the month of June in 1962, the air over the Bukoba district had grown heavy, thick with a tension that seemed to vibrate through the very leaves of the banana trees. We find ourselves now at the absolute zenith of the phenomenon, a moment in history where the lines between psychological distress and physical reality blurred into a singular, harrowing sound. The epidemic was no longer a localized curiosity at a single boarding school in Kashasha. It had become a sprawling, invisible river, flowing through the red dust of the roads and into the hearts of multiple villages. The school at Kashasha, which had attempted to reopen in late May, was forced to shutter its doors once again as the fits returned with a renewed, almost desperate intensity. The desks sat empty, the chalkboards remained untouched, and the only thing that filled the corridors was a lingering, ghostly echo of a sound that no longer carried any warmth or joy. As the students of Kashasha returned to their homes, they carried the shadow of the illness with them. In the village of Nshamba, situated some distance from the original outbreak, the quiet rhythm of daily life was shattered. Imagine the scene as over 217 residents, mostly young people but some adults as well, began to succumb to the same rhythmic, gasping laughter. It was a wave that moved from house to house. A girl would sit by the fire, and suddenly her shoulders would begin to shake. Her mother might reach out to steady her, only to watch in horror as the laughter turned into a scream, then back into a hollow, barking sound that could last for hours. The villagers described a feeling of something moving inside their heads, a restless spirit or a physical weight that demanded release. In Nshamba alone, the outbreak lasted for over 34 days, leaving the community exhausted and terrified of their own voices. The geography of the laughter expanded further still, reaching the Ramasheni Girls' Middle School. Here, 48 more students were drawn into the cycle. The symptoms were becoming more diverse and more punishing. It was never just the laughter. The girls would experience sudden, sharp pains in their sides, and their skin would break out in mysterious, angry rashes. Some would faint, their bodies going limp as if the effort of the laughter had simply drained their spirits entirely. When they woke, they were often gripped by a profound restlessness, a need to move or run that was occasionally met with violence if anyone tried to restrain them. The doctors who arrived to study the cases were baffled. They performed lumbar punctures and analyzed the food and the water, searching for a toxin or a virus, but the results always came back perfectly normal. There was no fever, no infection, only the relentless, rhythmic heaving of chests and the wet sound of tears mixing with the laughter. At the height of this peak, 14 different schools across the region were forced to close their gates. Imagine the silence that must have fallen over those institutions. Usually, a school is a place of organized sound, the chanting of lessons, the ringing of bells, the chatter of lunch. But in mid-1962, these places became islands of stillness. In the village of Kanyangoreka, the spread continued unabated. The estimate of those affected rose steadily until it surpassed 1,000 individuals. This was a massive portion of the adolescent population in these rural areas. The authorities were overwhelmed. There were rumors that the very air had been poisoned by atomic tests, or that the maize flour used in the school kitchens had been tainted with a strange madness. But as the sun set over Lake Victoria, casting long, purple shadows across the water, the truth remained just out of reach, hidden in the psyche of a generation caught between two worlds. The psychological weight of the era cannot be ignored. Tanganyika had only recently gained its independence from Britain in December of the previous year. The world was changing at a dizzying pace. These young students were the first to carry the burden of a new national identity, facing immense pressure from their families and their teachers to succeed in a system that was often alien to their traditional upbringing. The laughter was a safety valve, an explosive release of internal pressure that had nowhere else to go. It was a language of the body spoken when words failed. During these peak months, the epidemic was a collective cry for help that manifested as a mirthless grin. Parents in the surrounding villages began to sue the schools, blaming the institutions for allowing this infection of the mind to spread to their children. The social fabric was fraying, and every new case added another stitch of fear to the landscape. Close your eyes and try to hear the sound of 1,000 people caught in this loop. It is not the sound of a joke shared among friends. It is a sharp, staccato sound, like a bird trapped in a wooden box. It is the sound of exhaustion. Some individuals would suffer through these fits for as long as 16 days. Their bodies barely allowed a few moments of peace before the cycle began again. They would be left with dilated pupils and exaggerated reflexes, their nervous systems frayed to the breaking point. And yet, the teachers and the urbanized adults remained largely untouched, as if they were tuned to a different frequency. The epidemic chose the young, those most sensitive to the shifts in the cultural wind. By the end of June, the peak was so high that it seemed as though the entire region might simply dissolve into this strange, hysterical rhythm. A world where no one could speak, because everyone was too busy laughing at a joke that didn't exist. As we watch the figures climb past 1,000, we see the true scale of the crisis. It was a landscape of closed doors and shuttered windows. The village of Nshamba became a place where people spoke in whispers, terrified that a loud noise or a sudden movement might trigger another outbreak. The girls at Ramasheni were isolated, but still, the laughter found them. It seemed to leap across distances, traveling through the stories told by travelers and the anxiety shared by mothers at the market. It was a ghost that could not be caught, a fire that burned without heat. The sheer number of schools involved, 14 in total, meant that an entire year of education for these children was effectively erased, replaced by a medical mystery that would haunt the annals of sociology for decades to come. The peak was a mountain of sound, and as June faded into July, the people of Tanganyika could only wait and wonder if the laughter would ever truly fall silent. As the sun began to set on the year 1962, a heavy, velvet-like exhaustion settled over the Bukoba district. The feverish energy that had sustained the laughter for so many months was finally beginning to cool, like embers in a hearth that have nothing left to consume. The air around Lake Victoria remained humid and thick, but the frantic, jagged sound of hundreds of voices laughing in discord had started to soften. It was a gradual retreat, not a sudden silence. Imagine a tide slowly pulling away from a battered shoreline, leaving behind only the damp sand and the quiet debris of what was once a storm. The villages, which had been vibrating with a terrifying, inexplicable mirth, were now entering a period of deep reflection. Mothers sat on their doorsteps, watching the long shadows stretch across the red earth, listening for a sound they no longer wished to hear. The terrifying novelty of the illness had worn thin, replaced by a collective weariness that reached into the very bones of the community. By the time December of 1962 arrived, the reports of new outbreaks had slowed to a trickle. The doctors, Rankin and Phillip, who had spent so much time observing the dilated pupils and the restless movements of the schoolgirls, began to notice a shift in the clinical atmosphere. The fits were becoming shorter, lasting only minutes instead of days. The violent thrashing and the desperate running that had accompanied the laughter began to fade into simple, quiet weeping or a distant, glassy-eyed stare. The 1,000 people who had been touched by this strange phenomenon were now emerging from it like survivors of a long, confusing dream. Their throats were often sore from the months of strain, and their bodies felt heavy with the weight of a spent adrenaline. In the mission schools, the administrators looked at the empty hallways with a mixture of hope and profound caution, wondering if the peace they now felt was permanent or merely a pause before another wave of the unknown. The story of the school at Kashasha is perhaps the most poignant example of this slow recovery. After the initial closure in March and the failed attempt to reopen in May, the gates had remained shut for a long duration. When the teachers finally returned to prepare the classrooms once more, the silence was absolute. They walked through the dormitories where, only months before, 95 students had been lost to a contagion of the mind. They wiped the dust from wooden desks and organized the lesson books that had sat untouched since the 30th of January. There was a specific, lingering scent in those rooms, a mix of old paper, floor wax, and the ghost of a collective panic. When the girls eventually returned in early 1963, they did not come back with the same vibrant energy they once possessed. They moved through the corridors with a newfound stillness, their eyes meeting in the hallways with a shared understanding that required no words. The laughter had been a bridge they all crossed together, and now they stood on the other side, looking back at a landscape they could no longer truly describe. As 14 different schools across the region began to function again, the educators noticed a strange phenomenon. The students were remarkably quiet. The usual boisterous play and the whispered jokes of adolescence seemed to have been dampened. It was as if the community had collectively decided that silence was the only safe harbor left. Pencils scraped against paper in the quiet heat of the afternoon, and the teachers spoke in softened tones, careful not to pierce the fragile calm they had worked so hard to regain. There were still occasional ripples, a sudden intake of breath, a nervous giggle that would cause a whole room to freeze in momentary terror. But the chain reaction no longer took hold. The psychological tension that had built up during the transition to independence and the cultural shifts of the era had found its release, and the pressure valve was finally closed. The epidemic had lasted 18 months, a staggering span of time for a phantom illness to hold a nation in its grip, but its departure was as invisible as its arrival. In the final medical assessments, it was noted that there were no lasting physical scars. The rashes had cleared, the headaches had dissipated, and the respiratory systems of the afflicted returned to their natural rhythms. Yet the psychological landscape of Tanganyika was forever altered. The doctors concluded that this had been a classic case of mass psychogenic illness, a manifestation of stress that the body could not otherwise articulate. It was a physical language spoken by those who had no other way to express the weight of a changing world. As the observers packed their bags and the news cycles moved on to other mysteries, the people of the Bukoba district were left with the task of forgetting. They buried the memory of the Laughing Plague under the routines of daily life, the planting of crops, the washing of clothes in the lake, and the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the village schools. The echo of the laughter grew fainter with every passing month, until it was nothing more than a ghost story whispered to keep children quiet in the evening. Now the hillsides near Kashasha are quiet once again. The grass grows tall where the children once ran in aimless, frantic circles, and the waters of Lake Victoria lap gently against the shore, undisturbed by the sound of 1,000 voices in crisis. The mystery of why it started on that particular Tuesday in January remains, locked in the minds of those 3 original girls, a secret shared between their past and the silence of the present. As we look back on those 18 months, we see not a joke, but a profound human moment of shared struggle and shared recovery. The laughter has ended, replaced by the steady, comforting breath of a community at rest. The world is still, the schools are dark, and the shadows are long and peaceful. The echo has finally faded into the cool night air, leaving only the sound of the wind through the trees and the deep, restorative quiet of a world that is finally, truly safe. Lake Victoria continued to lap against the shore with a rhythmic, indifferent pulse. The air in the village of Kashasha today carries a heavy silence. Where the green, rolling landscape of modern Tanzania meets the horizon, the shadows stretch long over ground that once vibrated with a sound both human and haunting. If you stood there now, you would hear only the rustle of leaves. The mission school, once the center of a storm that baffled medical minds, has seen its stories pass into the realm of legend. The energy of 1962 has dissipated, leaving only the ghost of a question. We look back at these events not with the confusion of those who lived through them, but with a quiet, reflective distance. For decades, researchers have pored over data, searching for a trace of a virus, a toxin in the water, or a contaminant in the food supply. They found nothing. The blood tests were clean and the environment was pristine. What they discovered instead was the immense power of the human mind. The diagnosis of mass psychogenic illness is often misunderstood as a suggestion that the suffering was not real. But for the 1,000 people who felt their lungs tighten and their limbs grow heavy, the pain was as real as any physical ailment. It was a conversion reaction, a process where the internal weight of the spirit is translated into the language of the flesh. Laughter was not an expression of joy. It was a scream with nowhere else to go, a release for unsustainable pressure. 1961 brought a monumental shift to Tanganyika. Independence was a time of immense hope, but also of profound uncertainty. For the young students at the boarding schools, expectations had suddenly shifted. They were the first generation of a new era, caught between the traditional ways of their ancestors and the rigid, foreign expectations of a British-run educational system. This cultural dissonance created a unique type of friction. When we feel we have no power over our circumstances, and the world demands more than we can give, the mind can fracture in strange ways. The three girls who first began to laugh on that January afternoon were not merely sharing a joke. They were the first to surrender to a collective exhaustion that had been building for years. As the laughter moved from the schoolhouse in Kashasha to the surrounding villages of Nshamba and Bukoba, it revealed the invisible threads that connect us all. We often think of ourselves as isolated individuals, but this epidemic proved that our emotions are porous. There is a concept in psychology known as the laugh detector, a primitive part of our brain that responds instinctively to the sounds of others. Over those 18 months, that detector was stuck in an endless loop. 14 schools were forced to close their doors as the phenomenon refused to be contained by walls. It was a reminder that we are mirrors to one another, reflecting the shadows and the light of our neighbors, until the line between me and you begins to blur in the heat of shared experience. Eventually, the laughing fits began to subside. The waves grew smaller and the intervals of peace grew longer, until one day, the last echo faded into the forest. There were no lasting physical scars or permanent damage to the brain, but the memory remained, a strange footnote in the history of East Africa. It serves as a testament that our health is not just a matter of biology, but of community and context. When we ignore the needs of the soul, the body will find a way to speak, even if that speech sounds like uncontrollable giggles in a classroom. The hills of Kashasha remain a place of quiet beauty, holding the secret of those 18 months close, as the world continues to move forward into the unknown. As we turn away from the old medical journals, we are left with profound empathy for those 95 students who first felt the world slip away. Their story reminds us that it is okay to feel the weight of existence, and that sometimes the only way through the darkness is to let go. The history of the Tanganyika laughter plague is now tucked away in the archives, no longer a source of fear, but a gentle reminder of our shared humanity. The world is large and full of mysteries we may never fully solve, and that is where we find our peace. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.